Welcome to The Screen Queen, the show where I'll be talking about your favorite show or your favorite movie. You'll just have to find out what you're about to know. This is your Screen Queen, your host, Samantha Parrish. Well, it's a good thing Anthony Hopkins got that Oscar from the movie because it did not save his relationship with Martha Stewart one bit. Hello there and welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for tuning in to the third episode of the Halloween series here on The Screen Queen. So, I never found Silence of the Lambs as a scary movie, and yet here we are. For the past 12 years, being a movie buff, The Silence of the Lambs is one of the films that I had no idea how I was supposed to feel about it. It confused me to no end because I never found it to be a horror movie. I always found it to be a thriller, which is the other genre that it's classified as, but it's first and foremost a horror movie. So I'm sitting there like, okay, what did I miss? I don't get it. This thing won 5 Oscars for Best Horror Movie, and Hannibal Lector is known as one of the horror movie villains, not thriller movie villains. What's going on here? And I thought maybe I'm just so desensitized because I'm so used to seeing thrilling material that I did not see what everyone else saw. And it's also a different experience that I watched this at a time where there are scarier things that have come up since The Silence of the Lambs. So I wasn't sure if that experience was already gone, left the station, do not go, do not collect $200, gone. And then I expressed these feelings to my friend Rachel when we were watching The Silence of the Lambs together. And she's also a major fan of horror movies. And I told her I don't really find The Silence of the Lambs scary. And it's strange that I can't see what everyone else sees. And I love the answer that she gave me because it was the very thing that challenged me to see this film differently for the first time. She said to me, "It's the idea that something bad can happen to you. That's what The Silence of the Lambs provides." And I'm like, shit. She's right, and I'm going to go see that. It really challenged me to see it for what it offered, and the legacy that The Silence of the Lambs has. I have to remind myself that The Silence of the Lambs is the winner of 5 Oscars, and it's the first horror movie to ever have the honor of winning an Oscar. This film is by all means amazing. I have to give credit where credit's due. It might not be my favorite thriller, but I've always appreciated this was the ultimate tester of the 90s. If you really look at this film and its time placement being 1991, that was a ballsy move. Having to make a film about someone who skins women. Now this is like a little side note I gotta talk about. Oftentimes, whenever there's gore, there is someone running to the projector to rip the film up because they know they're going to get fired or in jail. Because this is seen as obscene. Really, think about that. There was a horror movie that came out, I believe it was called Feast of Blood. I think it came out in 1963. If I got it wrong, I'll have in the description box and I'll put a oopsie doopsie poopsie I got it wrong note. When that film premiered, no one was ready for the amount of gore that was in that film. So the projectionist was literally running down the hall like, I'm so fired! And it caused a whole bunch of problems. That's how far that it's come from 1960s to the 70s to 80s to 90s, but there had to be an edge around it. There are a lot of things you can get away with as long as you have a level of intelligence. This was a film that is the ultimate test of the time back in the 1990s. Without that film, I don't think that you would have the rest of the 90s taking it to that edge, like Seven, The Bone Collector. There are probably several other movies that I can think of in the 90s, but unfortunately my forte is not 90s movies because I'm an 80s baby for my criteria of movies that I love in a certain decade. But this also still feels like it has a little bit of 80s in it, while also being a film that is progressing to the 90s. But at the same time, if you look at it, it doesn't feel like a film that's a time capsule in the era of the 90s. I don't really see any staples of the 80s or 90s in here for how very simply stylized it was, because it wasn't going for style, it was going for the senses. It was going for the psychiatry. That was like the name of the game for The Silence of the Lambs. That's the whole identity of the film, really, is the power of suggestion, for why it was able to get away with what it did. And I didn't realize it until the recent time I watched it, that there's a lot of power in this movie, and it's purely in the suggestion. When you really look at the plot of The Silence of the Lambs, I mean, say it with me. A cannibal psychiatrist that has to help an FBI trainee find a killer in West Virginia that skins women. It kind of begs the question in your mind, am I going to see a lot of cannibalism happen? Am I going to see a lot of skinning of women happen? You have two villains in this movie. You have Buffalo Bill and Hannibal Lecter, and yet you only get about one scene for what they're known for. In a majority of certain films with antagonists that are murderers and whatever act of violence they commit, you see several acts of that being committed. Yet it's just one time you see it in the film. Strangely, that works as a better payoff. You have more time in this one specific scenario to take that in. You have time to process it. We've been told what they've done to people, the very ways that they did it. It's up to us to paint the picture in our minds at our own discretion, and we have to be ready for it whether we are or not. These two moments that I'm going to talk about are tiny spoilers at the near end of the film, but I just wanted to give a heads up, and then I'm going to put a timestamp that if you don't want to be spoiled, you can go ahead and click where it will head off after the spoiler. Okay? Awesome. So the first scene that I have to talk about is a very minuscule moment where Buffalo Bill is at his sewing machine and he is sewing the skin together, making the woman's suit that has been talked about throughout the film. And then there's another moment. The moment that Hannibal Lecter attacks the security guards. You have one moment that makes up for what we've already known about these characters. But it's better that way. It's better to see one act of violence than to see several acts of violence. And that works for the film to be able to balance it. Otherwise, that'd be a lot to put into this one film. There's already a lot of heavy elements of psychological factors. It did a good job balancing the physical violence with the psychological warfare in this film. There's a scene near the beginning of the film that encapsulates how much this film has with the power of suggestion. When Dr. Chilton is walking Clarisse Starling down to the cell where all the psychos are. And he explains to her who Hannibal Lecter is, even though he's trying to get into her pantalonuses. And he takes out a picture of a nurse. We don't see this picture, but the way that the description goes in that picture for what happened to her because of Hannibal Lecter. Okay, one, that's really freaking creepy that Dr. Chilton just has that chilling in his pocket like some mom that keeps pictures of her kids in a wallet. Like, that's just too weird. I'm like, you're taking some pride and some pain, Dr. Chilton. That's not cool. Well, then again, yeah, that's what he does. That makes sense. And two, that picture we don't see paints us the picture, but it's up to us to paint the picture. The Silence of the Lambs is a film that's like a blank canvas, and the film tells you what's going on, and it gives you the paintbrush, and it's up to you. Do you really want to paint that picture? Do you really want to know what's going on? It kind of gives you the option if you want to proceed. And it's all because of the suggestion. It really is a film all about power. It is still, all the way, a horror film, but it's a film about power. But one of the best examples in this film, it's Clarisse Starling. If you really look at her character, there are numerous times in this film that she's been undermined as an FBI trainee. Not because she's a trainee, but because she's a woman. There have been other situations with movie characters that have to rise above power, but not in an environment like the one presented in The Silence of the Lambs. It's an entirely different gameplay. especially right down to the way that Clarisse Starling is undermined constantly in her profession as an FBI in training. She really is getting the ultimate test as an FBI agent. Now, this isn't really a well-known fact, but one of the reasons we had The Silence of the Lambs with Clarisse Starling was an attempt to get more women to be recruited into the FBI. Showing, look at what Clarisse Starling can do. It's like one of those, like, we want you for the army kind of a thing, except you get 2 hours of what this woman goes through just to catch a killer in West Virginia. And it is kind of odd that they pitch that, and yet Clarisse is really crapped on for a majority of the film. She does handle this with gumption, and she's got a lot of strength, and you do have to have a lot of strength to get through there, and it is going to be a risky environment for a woman because of the time frame back then. It was still a long way for women in a workforce. It does give the example, but it's not really good that what they show is the shit she goes through outside of the whole FBI investigation for how she's treated because of a woman. There are a couple scenes I remember where Clarisse is in the, I think it's the funeral home mortuary where they're examining one of Buffalo Bill's victims, and she goes, "All right, attention guys," and all the officers are just looking at her like they don't want to pay attention to her. One guy's giving her the elevator eyes, and she's got no power. Yet the only person that gives her time of day is the guy in the cell that eats livers with fava beans and a nice Chianti. When you look at that dynamic, when you see who takes her serious more, that's a really weird fact that they had to sell this film as trying to recruit FBI agents when it's like, well, they won't take you seriously, but it looks like this killer will. It's kind of strange. Not the whole point of the film, but again, when you look at that, it's kind of strange to see it like that, and it gets a little confusing, but it was the 90s. It's one of those things that we look at film and we can't take too much fault for it, knowing that the times were changing and that was the base that we were going for in films to eventually get a placement for women in media. Well, it's not too bad, but we had to start somewhere, as much as it's really uncomfortable to look at. Because of the amount of intelligence in this film, it does get away with showing or talking about the horrific content. But it also got away with something else, which was the time frame. We have 2 entirely different movies going on because of the way the cast is scattered. I don't know if anyone else sees what I see, but it's kind of like we have movie A and movie B. We have movie A with Hannibal Lecter and Clarisse Starling, and then we have movie B with Buffalo Bill and Clarisse Starling. So we're having to go back and forth between 2 different stories, but we never really feel that one story outweighs the other. That we are going back and forth in a very good segue to seeing Hannibal Lecter in this one moment, then we see Buffalo Bill in this one moment. But because Buffalo Bill and Hannibal Lecter have the same amount of intrigue, it does keep you going to be invested into a 2-hour and something movie. Except here's the really weird thing about this 2-hour and something movie. You only see Hannibal Lecter for about 24 minutes out of this 2-hour and something movie. That's 24 minutes that guaranteed Anthony Hopkins an Oscar. That is very strange. He's one of few people that have been able to win an Oscar solely based off of a performance and the astounding time frame that's only 24 minutes of screen time, that was enough time it took for people to be like, I like his performance, give him an Oscar. But unfortunately, because of that, Anthony Hopkins' girlfriend at the time was not on board with it. Back in the day, Martha Stewart and Anthony Hopkins were an item, and because of that performance, she left him. She couldn't look at Anthony Hopkins the same way again. All she saw was Hannibal Lecter, which is kind of good and kind of bad. There is a strange credit that I've noticed with The Silence of the Lambs, is that it's credited as a great horror movie, but the rest of the movies are not shared with the credit. When you look at certain horror movies like People will say the Jason series, the Halloween series, but you don't really hear people say the Hannibal Lecter series. They'll say The Silence of the Lambs. It's pinpointed to this movie. So, the other ones are okay. I'm not the biggest fan of them, but I appreciate what they've done. Mostly because I'm not really the biggest Hannibal Lecter fan, so I can't really give a distinguished review or like a concrete answer on my feelings about it, because I'm neutral. It is hard to follow the coattails of something like The Silence of the Lambs, and there's been this very tricky history when you look at the entirety of the movies. So Hannibal Lecter first started out in Manhunter. That's where we began. That's where it started with Will Graham, who was the main character of the Hannibal series. But that didn't really go anywhere. And if memory serves, Lecter is also spelled differently. I believe it's with a K in the original. And then, after 1986, we move on to 1991, where we have The Silence of the Lambs. And then, strangely, I thought, well, wait a minute, if Hannibal Lecter first came out in 1986, then isn't The Silence of the Lambs considered a sequel? It is not. It's a strange retconning that they've done to Manhunter, and wanted to have the whole thing fresh, so in a way, The Silence of the Lambs is considered one of the first reboots for a horror series. And then we move on, years later, we have Hannibal, and then Red Dragon, and then whatever in the heck Hannibal Rising was. But there's something to be said about this horror series, is that each of these movies can stand on their own. They have their own identity in the entirety of a series, but as a pinnacle part of the horror culture. When we look at a horror series, it's usually just all meshed into one, kind of like fruit, like a whole bag of fruit. Like, yep, that all belongs in one bag. Yet, The Silence of the Lambs is something that is kept out of the bag, and it's placed in different parts of cinema history. It doesn't stay all together. Every story is uniquely different. That doesn't feel like it's a sequel, almost. It feels like it's its own movie. It's strange to have to see it like that, but I've never really been able to see the Hannibal series as a series. I've only ever seen it as an individual series, despite the fact it's all connected to the same character of Hannibal Lecter. I hope that people understand what I'm coming across with this, but that is something that I happen to think about recently, is the way that it is placed in cinema history. It is The Silence of the Lambs is hard to categorize, and with its sequels, that makes it even harder to categorize because of the coattails of the legacy, and then everything that followed through with the other movies. It's hard to really place it if it should be judged back to the predecessor. And it's really hard. A lot of people have found it very hard to judge these movies, from what I gather. Someone has taken away something from the experience of watching Hannibal or Red Dragon, Manhunter back in the day, or the Hannibal series. It has its own unique identity, and strangely, it's all balanced. No one has ever really said that the series decreased in value because of the movies. They might not like a change, but someone has always taken away something good out of the Hannibal movies. But like with all great films, there's going to be something in the film that is going to have a problem. This was something I didn't think about when I first watched The Silence of the Lambs, but I remember reading that people had a problem with this film, and it even boycotted the film when it came out. Because the character Buffalo Bill being a character that skins women in order to become one, that was seen as homophobic and transphobic. I haven't thought about that for quite some time, so I'm going to take the time to see both sides to this. This is going to be a little tricky, so you might have to bear with me. So we have one side of the spectrum where gay people at the time had accused the film of being transphobic and homophobic because they have a character that is gay. We're just going to go ahead and say Buffalo Bill is gay. And Buffalo Bill has feminine interests, and with the sewing and everything, and the fact that he wants to become a woman. I get where they're coming from. I understand, even though I'm not a gay person, even though I'm a proud bisexual, it was difficult times back then. Gay people were not respected back then, and sometimes gay people were the butt of the joke, or they were made out to be like the enemy. It was very tricky to put gay people into films. So then we have this grand film that comes up, and looking at all the pieces, that it's a character who's gay and he's doing terrible things to women. Yes, Buffalo Bill is a disgusting, maddening character. But my personal take, you don't have to agree with me. Sexuality has nothing to do with his crimes. Him being gay has nothing to do with his crimes. It's his psyche. He got this in his mind that if he can't get the sex reassignment surgery, then he justified killing women to make that happen. I hope to God that it makes sense and that I haven't offended anybody, but that's from what I've seen. And there's also something that I thought about when it was addressed in the film, that he tried to have a sex reassignment surgery and he was denied. Homosexuality was considered a mental illness until 1973, and then it was no longer decreed as mental illness. It was someone's choice to love the same gender. But times were not acclimating back then, even in the 90s. So looking at the time frame from the 70s and 80s that were not accepting of gay people quite yet, then you have a film that, yeah, it does look like they're against gay people because you have a character that's doing bad things. But it's really not him as a gay person, it's him as a madman. That's what it comes down to. It was a tricky time in the 90s. The 90s was an era that was going into heavy-hitting topics. And by having a character that is a whole mess, just a mess of a human being, but him being gay has nothing to do with it. It's not supposed to be a film that makes people feel scared of transgender people or to be scared of gay people. But today, honestly, I can't see it still being complained about now that the time has evolved and people are reanalyzing this film. I hope I explained it very well. I'm not really good with psychology, and when it comes to the complaints people have about certain films, I try my best to keep it neutral, to remember its time period and how it's aged today, and I hope that I was able to get both perspectives elaborated so it feels like both sides are said. All of the elements in the Silence of the Lambs film is something to really appreciate, but the one thing that does have people very divided is remembering where Hannibal Lecter came from. I mean, don't get me wrong. I have to give credit where credit's due. Anthony Hopkins knocked it out of the park as Hannibal Lecter, and in Hannibal, and in some parts that I remembered of Red Dragon, and a lot of people have thus said how much they love Hannibal Lecter, and then the whole series came out with Mads Mikkelsen where they're like, oh my god, I love Hannibal Lecter, he's so sexy, and it's like, it's a little bit, actually no, it's a bit uncomfortable for the very scary support that people give to Hannibal Lecter. Now, I know that there are some people out there that did their homework and did their research and found out who Hannibal Lecter is based off of, and it was still a shocker to me to find out that Hannibal Lecter is based off of a real-life person. I don't know how many of my listeners out there follow a lot of crime stories. Hannibal Lecter is based off of a real-life serial killer cannibal named Ed Gein. It's alarming knowing where Hannibal Lecter came from, so it makes me scared when some people say how much they love the villainous ways of Hannibal Lecter. It's like, do you know where he came from? It's like, it's too soon to say it. No, like, let me give you your homework and you're gonna find out who this person's based off of and you might change your sentence. It's kind of a tough call that it kind of supports the serial killer. There can be a healthy fascination with a villain, and I'm one of those people that I do enjoy a good villain. But I enjoy them when I know the realistic qualities about them, that I'm not endorsing something about them that I should not be endorsing. There are some people that get flack for it, but as long as you have the sense of realism, like, there's nothing wrong with saying that your favorite character is a villain. If there's something that you take away from them that fascinates you, and heck, there are a lot of villains out there that have inspired many people to look into psychiatry, to look into wondering how that works, not wanting to be the villain themselves. That's where the line is drawn. It's a tough call. There's a lot of blurred lines when it comes to seeing the villains portrayed in the media and where they come from. It just depends on how we take in that information. Just like with recent in the news about Evan Peters playing Jeffrey Dahmer and people wanting other actors to play various serial killers, not knowing that that's a killer that's being portrayed. So looking at Silence of the Lambs portrayed a parallel that was going on in the time period where people were scared about what Ed Gein was doing to women by killing them and eating them. It's a tough call. It's a very tough call with how we have killers portrayed in the media, whether it's a biography or something like Silence of the Lambs, where it does talk about the whole scary world out there, about what people like Hannibal Lecter can do and what people like Buffalo Bill can do. Strangely, that's kind of, again, why I never found it scary, was I found it to be very informative, knowing that's where Hannibal Lecter came from. That's the kind of scary I have to know about. You take what you want from the film. Everyone has a different interpretation for how they view the film and how they learn from it. And when it comes to films like that, that's my takeaway. I've never been afraid of films that I know it can give me information about how I can protect myself as a woman. So I don't really have a proper segue into this next piece I want to talk about. I just really found this interesting and just want to address it. And it makes me laugh when I think about this scene now. Which is funny considering there's nothing funny about the Silence of the Lambs. Yet, once you know this, you can't not see this when you watch the Silence of the Lambs. So, in this scene, Clarisse Starling has been informed by Barney the orderly to stay to the right. And she walks. And you are introduced through her eyes of the many psychopaths in this cell. The first one that comes up is this big guy, all smiles. That actor is from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. That is the character, Chef Brockett, played by Don Brockett. So I can imagine back then in 1991 for the people that loved Mr. Rogers and were not expecting to see the chef from Mr. Rogers in Silence of the Lambs. Can you imagine the people watching this going, oh my god, it's Chef Brockett, what's he doing here? I like to think about that. I love to find something in a movie, especially a horror movie, that will make me laugh to kind of take away from the scary experience, and finding something that is very interesting about a film above the many different interesting things. It's like these little minuscule interesting things, and I'm sure now the next time you watch it, you can't not unsee the chef from Mr. Rogers now. You're going to wonder how he got there. Like, did he snap finally in the neighborhood and that's why he's here? Did all of the puppets finally get to him and he was like, nope, I can't live like this? Did he skin the puppets and that's why? Oh, that's what he did probably. He probably skinned the puppets and that's why he's there. That's why he looks so friendly. Because he lost his mind in that neighborhood. But there's also another interesting factor in that scene. For the very first time, Clarisse Starling is in the Baltimore Psychiatric Institute. It's Barney. Barney is very kind, mild-mannered. He helps Clarisse. He doesn't undermine her. He's probably one of the very few decent people in the whole movie. I mean, yes, Clarisse is decent as well, but to have someone that is nice to our main character, that way it's not like, crap, why is everyone crapping on this poor girl? And having a character like Barney does strangely balance things out for a little bit. I mean, yeah, he's not present for a lot of the films, but you do know that he's mentioned. There's a part where he turns the lights on for Hannibal, and Hannibal, sure enough, says, thank you, Barney. And Every time that Clarisse comes by, he's right out there ready with an umbrella, very attentive. It's very strange. I don't know if anyone's noticed that that's basically the only kind moment in the film is with Barney. I don't know if anyone else noticed this, but I feel like it had to be addressed. And it also goes to say that I must have been so impressive enough that Barney's in all of the Hannibal Lecter movies. And ironically, it's the Hannibal Lecter series, but Hannibal Lecter is only played by Anthony Hopkins for 3 movies, but Barney, played by Frankie Faison, is in all 4 movies. And let's count it out. Manhunter, The Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal, Red Dragon. However, Frankie Faison only played the character Barney for 3 movies. His appearance in Manhunter, he did not play the character Barney, he played a character named Lieutenant Fisk. But because of the entirety of this man being involved with the Hannibal Lecter movies, I mean, I'm not going to call him Lieutenant Fisk, I'm going to call him Barney, because that's the character he played for the majority of it. Barney's the glue of the entire Hannibal Lecter series. Well, not really, but in terms of having someone that you would not think be present because he's just one of those characters off the side and you forget about him. But really, let's pay more attention to Barney. If there's one word that can perfectly describe Hannibal Lecter, it's unpredictable. Hannibal is a very mysterious character that, yeah, we might know everything about him. He's a psychiatrist, but that makes a lot of different suggestions about what's in his arsenal, about what he can do as a psychiatrist, but also what he can do physically, because he is capable of physical violence. And we've seen 2 examples of that in the film. However, that should also be said about the actor that plays him as well. Anthony Hopkins was an unpredictable actor in this entire film. There's a featurette that I watched that aired in 1991 where all the actors are being interviewed about their role to play in the film, and Jodie Foster had shared that no one knew what he was going to do in the character of Hannibal. During the very first scene where Hannibal gives her back the report and he immediately ridicules and defines Clarisse Starling. And you can see it in her eyes, in Jodie Foster's eyes, that she's like, what in the hell is going on? And it's a look of raw, genuine confusion and disgust. She revealed in the featurette that it pissed her off that he did that. But she knew why. If you look at that scene, Anthony Hopkins wants Clarisse Starling to be pissed off. Clarisse Starling is being profiled by a incarcerated psychiatrist. It should piss her off. In a way, it's kind of like a wake-up call for her, like, hey, you want to play with the big dogs? This is what's going to happen. It really does impact the scene a whole lot more knowing that Anthony Hopkins just did that, and no one knew it. And the best part? His iconic line, I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti, had a little tiny, extraness to it. The hiss was unplanned. So after that little pause, he just goes, the director jumped in his seat. No one knew that he was going to do it, and it was confirmed by the production that they were all alarmed. Before I make my closing notes about The Silence of the Lambs, I want to talk about a little story about what The Silence of the Lambs means to me. Even though I mentioned that I'm not the biggest fan of the movie, but it does have a special place in my heart because of the way my mom reacted to it. My mom told me back in 1992 when she first saw this movie, she said she had to have a pee buddy. So every time she went to the bathroom, she had to have like a designated bodyguard outside of her bathroom because she was fully convinced that Hannibal Lecter was going to get her. My mom and horror movies are not really best friends, but because The Silence of the Lambs was such a big movie back then that regardless of not liking the genre of horror, people were that intrigued by watching the movie. So knowing that information that my mom's not a horror fan, but she watched it and she got through it, that did really make me think about the film in a whole perspective about how people can be open to different genres. This was the shocking film of the 90s And really, if you think about it, it was like the first film that set it in stone for darker content in films to be normalized and projected. That people were willing to take a chance on something like The Silence of the Lambs. People were shocked by it, but also impressed by it. People had to respect what it did and what it created, and taking the gall to be able to tackle heavy things like transsexuals, heinous crimes, psychological warfare, gender warfare, power play. There's so many things in Silence of the Lambs that makes it more than just a horror film, and I've been saying it throughout the entire duration of this episode, but really looking at it, it's the film of the jack of all trades. You take the film for however you want to, and it's impressive to know that our cinema is not complete without The Silence of the Lambs. There are numerous references in TV shows and movies. Hell, I even made a reference to it in my book, Inglorious Inc. Someone has been impacted by The Silence of the Lambs in one way or another. Everyone has some part of the film that they take away, whether it's quoting it, or observing it, or learning from it, being scared by it, intrigued by anything, really. It's just one of those films that definitely earned its place as one of the best movies of all time. Truly has. So that is officially the end of the episode about The Silence of the Lambs. Thank you so much for listening to this. I honestly had a lot of fun researching the movie and getting to learn more about it, and it definitely makes me think differently than the way I originally thought of it. It's the first film on this list that I felt indifferent to, but now I appreciate it more than I did before. So I think we all definitely appreciate this film more, and I'm glad that I got to kind of partake in that experience as well, even though I'm the podcaster, not the listener. But it's nice that that experience branches to all of us. Okay, so I'm exhausted. We're going to wrap up this episode and find out what the final episode of the Halloween series is going to be. Alright, I got a whole bunch of random suggestions in my little box, and we're going to find out what it's going to be. Let me just mix it up really good. Okay, I got one. Yep, it's one. Okay. Oh, what's this? I folded it too well. Okay, this is gonna be fun. Okay, awesome. I'm glad I get to talk about a movie that's not gonna be so heavy. Yay! Okay. The last episode of the Scream Queen Halloween series is going to be The Lost Boys. Oh my god, I'm hyped. Oh, I have ideas already. I'm looking forward to it. Okie dokie. Alright, stay safe everyone. Have an amazing October, and I will be back for the final episode, and it's going to air on Halloween. Okay, take care everyone. Bye-bye!